In September 1981, 23-year-old beauty school student Laura Kempton returned home after an evening out with a friend to the coastal city of Portsmouth, New Hampshire. She climbed the wooden steps to her apartment on Chapel Street, keys jingling in her hand, and entered alone. No one would see her alive again. That night, someone was waiting. Someone was watching. Someone decided that this young woman's life meant nothing to him. 42 years later, on a sweltering July day in 2023, advanced genetic genealogy technology finally allowed investigators to name the man who broke into her apartment that night and took her life with a blunt object and a brutality that shocked even seasoned detectives. But by then, the killer had been dead for 18 years, taking his secrets to the grave and leaving behind a trail of shattered lives. What happened in that Chapel Street apartment on that warm September night rocked the quiet seaside town to its core. A town where people were used to leaving their doors unlocked, where neighbors knew each other by name, where young women could walk home in the evening without fear. This crime linked the fates of two young women in a tragedy that investigators tried to solve for 4 decades, weathering changes in technology, generations of detectives, and the very nature of forensic science itself. If you value these stories about unsolved crimes and the long road to justice, please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Your support helps tell the stories of victims who must not be forgotten. Every subscription tells us that these lives mattered, that justice, even delayed, still matters. Part 1. The City by the Sea and the Girl with Dreams. Portsmouth, New Hampshire, in the early 80s, was a city of contrasts and transitions. Founded in 1623, it was one of America's oldest cities, with narrow streets that remembered colonial times, historic brick buildings whose foundations were laid before the Revolution, and the smell of salt ocean that permeated everything: clothes, hair, the streets themselves. The Atlantic Ocean lapped at its shores, and the port still remembered times when ships were built here for the young nation, when shipyards hummed with work, and sailors filled taverns after long months at sea. But by 1981, Portsmouth was undergoing a transformation, similar to many American cities of that time. The old shipyards were quietly dying, their warehouses converting into lofts, their docks becoming places for walks. Heavy industry was giving way to a new economy. Students filled cafes on Market Street, sipping coffee and discussing Reagan, trickle-down economics, the Cold War. Young professionals opened boutiques in historic buildings, turning old shops into trendy retail spaces. Nightlife thrived in bars along the waterfront, where jukeboxes played a mix of rock, disco, and a new sound that was just beginning to capture the airwaves: New Wave. The city's population was just over 25,000 people, large enough to have cultural life, small enough that everyone felt part of a community. This was a city where people still greeted strangers on the street, where local businesses knew their customers by name, where crime was rare and violent crime almost unheard of. In this world lived Laura Kempton. At 23 years old, Laura embodied the spirit of the early 80s. She was born in 1958, grew up during the social upheavals of the 60s, weathered the disappointments of the 70s, and now entered the new decade with optimism and energy. Those who knew her, and in Portsmouth she had many acquaintances, unanimously described her with the same words: free spirit, vibrant personality, love of new wave fashion. But these weren't just words in a police file written by a detective who never knew her. This was the essence of who Laura was. Everyone who interacted with her felt her energy. She walked into a room, and the room became brighter. She laughed, and her laughter was contagious. She talked with you, and you felt like you were the only person in the world who mattered at that moment. Her apartment on Chapel Street, number 2, was located on the ground floor of an old building in the city's historic district. The building was typical for Portsmouth: brick, 3 stories, built in the late 19th century. Wooden paneled door, tall windows, hardwood floors inside. It was convenient. From here, Laura could walk to Portsmouth Beauty School on Vaughan Mall, where she studied the art of hairdressing. Beauty school was her calling, her future. Laura didn't just want to cut hair. She saw hairdressing as a form of creative expression, a way to help people feel beautiful, confident, transformed. At school, she was a diligent student. Her instructors noted her attention to detail, her willingness to practice for hours until technique became perfect. Classmates remembered how she experimented with new styles on training mannequins, creating bold, avant-garde hairstyles that reflected her own style. Because Laura had style, a very specific style. New wave fashion was more than just clothing for the early 80s generation. It was a statement, a rejection of disco-era excesses, an embrace of something more angular, more geometric, more intellectual. New wave meant bright colors next to black and white, geometric patterns, asymmetrical hairstyles, the boldness to be different, to stand out, to challenge norms. Laura wore it with pride. Her wardrobe was filled with pieces that made her stand out from the crowd, even in a city of young people. Bright blouses with sharp angles, skirts of unusual cuts, accessories that were simultaneously retro and futuristic. Her hair, her own canvas, was often styled in ways that made people turn their heads. She wasn't afraid to be noticed. She wanted to be noticed. This was her art form, her way of telling the world, I am here. I am unique. I don't apologize for who I am. Besides school, Laura had recently started working at a local gift shop called Macro Polo, Inc. The job was new, just a few weeks, but Laura had already fit into the team. The store specialized in imported goods, unusual gifts, things you wouldn't find in regular chain stores. For Laura, this was perfect. She knew how to interact with people, find the right words, make customers feel like welcomed guests. Behind the counter, she was in her element, recommending the perfect gift, sharing the story of some exotic item's origin, creating a connection with customers that turned a transaction into an experience. Her colleagues loved working with her. The store manager would later tell detectives that Laura was one of the best new employees they'd ever hired. Reliable, friendly, full of enthusiasm. She arrived on time, stayed late if needed, always with a smile. She was the kind of employee every employer dreams of. But work and school didn't exhaust Laura's life. She was social, very social. In an era before cell phones, before the internet, before social media, real social life meant going out, meeting people face to face, spending time in real space. Laura had a circle of friends she regularly saw. They went to bars on the waterfront where live bands played, to concerts at small clubs where new bands from Boston or even New York sometimes performed on their way to bigger venues, to movies at the old theater on Congress Street with its red velvet and classic architecture. Laura dated actively. At 23, she wasn't looking for a serious relationship, not thinking about marriage and children, not planning to settle down. She was simply enjoying life, the freedom that youth provides. Dating was casual, no commitments, no drama. The guys she dated would later tell detectives the same thing. Laura was fun, easygoing, no games, no manipulation. When relationships ended, they ended amicably. There was no jealousy, no stalking, no anger. Her friends remembered her laugh most of all. That laugh that started as a giggle and turned into full-blown, infectious joy that made everyone around join in. They remembered her energy, how she was always ready for an adventure, a spontaneous beach trip, a night of dancing, a new experience. They remembered how she could light up a room with her presence without being loud or demanding attention, just by being fully, authentically herself. Neighbors on Chapel Street knew Laura in passing, as you know neighbors in city buildings. She lived quietly, didn't throw loud parties, didn't create problems. Sometimes they saw her in the morning, hurrying to class with a bag over her shoulder, hair wet from the shower. Sometimes in the evening, returning from work in her Macro Polo uniform, or in bright clothes before an evening out with friends. She always said hello, always smiled. Small interactions that create the fabric of neighborhood life. Laura was the kind of person who made the world a bit brighter with her presence, even in brief moments on the stairs or by the mailboxes. She had plans: finish beauty school, get licensed, find work at a good salon, maybe in Portsmouth, maybe in a bigger city like Boston. Eventually, perhaps open her own salon. She talked about this with friends, her eyes lighting up when she described her vision, a modern, creative space where clients didn't just get a haircut, but an experience of transformation. This was her future. She could see it. She was moving toward it. September 27th, 1981, was an ordinary Saturday evening in Portsmouth. The day had been warm for late September, temperature holding around 70 degrees even after sunset. The kind of evening that makes people want to be outside, enjoying the last days before autumn chill arrives. Laura spent the evening with a friend. They met somewhere downtown, possibly at one of the waterfront bars where young people gathered on weekends. Maybe the Press Room, a popular spot with live music, or the Red Door, a quiet bar with good drinks, places where familiar faces mixed with tourists, where music blared from speakers, a mix of new wave, rock, maybe Blondie, The Cars, Tom Petty, the sounds that dominated radio at the time. They chatted, laughed, sipped drinks, enjoyed the simple pleasure of friendly companionship, maybe discussing classes at beauty school, maybe gossiping about guys, maybe planning future adventures, the usual topics of conversation for young women on a Saturday night. Nothing unusual, nothing that would foreshadow what was about to happen. At some point in the early morning of September 28th, the exact time remained uncertain, possibly 1 or 2 in the morning. Laura decided it was time to go home. Maybe she was tired. Maybe she had an early morning Sunday. Maybe she was just ready for her bed. Her friend walked her part of the way. Then they separated. It was a short walk. Chapel Street wasn't far from downtown, maybe 15 minutes on foot, less if you walked quickly. Portsmouth was a quiet city, a safe city. At least, that's what everyone thought. At 1 in the morning on a Sunday, the streets were mostly empty. Bars were beginning to close. The last patrons were dispersing homeward. Streetlights cast circles of yellow light on sidewalks. Somewhere in the distance, you could hear the ocean, the constant rhythm of waves against shore. Laura walked home alone, as she had done dozens of times before. She wasn't afraid. Why should she be? This was her city. These were her streets. Nothing bad happened here. She reached the building on Chapel Street, climbed the steps to the front door, took out her key from her bag, inserted it in the lock, turned. The door opened. She entered the hallway where mailboxes lined one wall, where stairs led to upper floors, where her apartment, number 2, was directly to the right. She approached her apartment door, opened it, walked inside, maybe turned on the light, maybe closed the door behind her, maybe started taking off her shoes, dropping her bag, getting ready for bed. She didn't know someone was watching her. Someone saw her enter. Someone was waiting for the moment when she'd be alone, vulnerable, unsuspecting. And she entered the final minutes of her life. Part 2. The morning that changed everything. The morning of Monday, September 28, 1981, began as an ordinary morning for Portsmouth police officer Ron Grivois. He was a police veteran, years of service behind him, had seen everything, from petty theft to bar brawls, from domestic disputes to the rare, more serious crimes. But in Portsmouth mostly, the work was routine: patrol, checks, community service, and protection. That morning he had a list of tasks, among them serving court summonses for various minor violations. On his list was Laura Kempton, address 20 Chapel Street, apartment 2. Reason: several unpaid parking meter tickets. The amount wasn't large, but the law is the law. Standard procedure. Serve the summons, get a signature, move on. Grivois expected this would take 5 minutes maximum. It was around 9:30 in the morning when he pulled up to the building at 20 Chapel Street. The morning was clear, cool. Temperature maybe 60 degrees. Sky blue. The kind of morning that promised a beautiful autumn day. The street was quiet. A few parked cars. Historic buildings silently lined the sidewalk. Grivois climbed the steps to the building's front door, found apartment number 2 on the ground floor. And immediately, before he even knocked, he knew something was wrong. The door was wooden, old, divided into rectangular panels, typical for buildings of that age. But one of the panels, the upper left, was missing. In its place was a hole, roughly torn or pushed out. A piece of thin metal was inserted in the opening, partially covering it, but clearly not part of the door's original construction. This was clearly not normal. A hole in the door, an improvised patch of metal, signs of a break-in. Grivois leaned down to look through the hole in the door. What he saw made his blood run cold. Through the remaining space, between the piece of metal and the doorframe, he could see inside the apartment. And there, on the living room floor, was a body. Legs were visible, bound with something. Skin pale, unnaturally still. Blood, a lot of blood, splattered on the far wall of the apartment, dark against light wallpaper, a spray pattern that spoke of violence, of force, of something terrible. Grivois immediately stepped back from the door, grabbed his radio. His voice, trained by years of service, remained steady, but there was urgency in it. He called for backup. Possible homicide. 20 Chapel Street, apartment 2. Need assistance immediately. Response came within seconds. Help on the way. Within minutes, police cars began arriving at the building on Chapel Street, their sirens cutting through the quiet morning, blue and red lights reflecting off brick building facades. Neighbors began looking out windows, coming onto porches, wondering what was happening. Detectives in plain clothes, crime scene technicians with their cases and equipment, the medical examiner, police photographers. Within minutes, the quiet historic street had become a crime scene. Police officer William Mortimer, a veteran of the Investigations Division, arrived among the first. Mortimer was an old-school detective, someone who had started service back in the 50s, when police work was different, more personal, more based on instinct and interrogation than on technology. But he had adapted to changes, embraced new methods, and earned a reputation as someone who solved cases. Tough, but fair. Thorough to the point of being meticulous. When Mortimer arrived on Chapel Street, Grivois briefly described the situation. Hole in the door, body inside, clear signs of violence. Mortimer nodded, his face serious. He approached the door, looked through the opening, confirmed what Grivois had reported. Then, following protocol, he ordered the door opened. Technicians photographed the door from outside, documented the hole in the panel, the metal piece. Then, carefully, so as not to disturb possible fingerprints, the door was opened. The smell hit them first. The sweet, metallic smell of blood, mixed with something else. The smell of death, which is impossible to describe, but impossible to forget once you've smelled it. Detectives, even seasoned ones, instinctively tensed. What they discovered inside Laura Kempton's apartment was a scene of brutal, deliberate, almost ritual violence. The kind of violence that spoke not just of a desire to kill, but of a desire to humiliate, to destroy, to erase the victim's humanity. The body lay on the floor in a room that served simultaneously as living room and bedroom, typical layout for a small studio apartment. Laura was naked. Her legs were bound together with a cord from an electric blanket, which had apparently been on the bed. The cord was wrapped tightly around her ankles, digging into the skin. A kitchen telephone cord, gray spiral cord of the old style, was wrapped around her neck and shoulder, but not tight enough to be the cause of death. It seemed more like a symbolic act than a functional one. On her head was a pillowcase, green in color, completely covering her face. The fabric was soaked with blood, dark stains spreading across the green surface. The medical examiner, who had arrived on scene, carefully removed the pillowcase. What was beneath it made even experienced detectives turn away for a moment. Laura's face was brutally beaten, not just bruises, not just cuts. This was systematic destruction. The left side of her head was smashed so severely that the skull in that area had almost collapsed inward. Bone was visible where skin had torn. Her features were mutilated almost beyond recognition. If not for documents in the apartment, if not for friends who would later confirm identity, identification would have been difficult. Blood was everywhere. It had soaked into the carpet beneath her head, creating a dark pool that hadn't completely dried yet. Blood spatter on the wall behind where the body lay formed a pattern directed upward and slightly to the side. Blood spatter experts would later analyze this pattern and say it was consistent with multiple blows from a blunt object, delivered with great force, during which blood flew at the moment of each impact. Next to the body, on the floor, lay a wine bottle. Glass, with a thick bottom, the type used for inexpensive wine. There were blood stains on the bottle. The medical examiner would later confirm that the size and shape of the bottle were consistent with the injuries on Laura's head. This was the murder weapon. But the bottle told another story. It hadn't broken. Despite the force of the blows, sufficient to crush a skull, the glass remained intact. This suggested the killer used the bottom of the bottle, the thickest part, for the blows. This required a certain way of holding it, a certain technique. This wasn't a random swing in panic. This was deliberate, controlled violence. The apartment was ransacked. Signs of struggle were everywhere. A small table in the living area was overturned. A lamp lay on its side, its shade dented. Pillows from the couch were scattered on the floor. Blankets from the bed were torn off and strewn about. Dresser drawers were open, contents partially pulled out, as if someone had been searching for something, quickly, not caring about order. This could suggest several things. Maybe Laura fought back, tried to defend herself, and in the struggle furniture moved, things fell. Maybe the killer was searching for money, valuables, after the murder. Maybe he was creating chaos just for chaos's sake, enjoying the destruction he created. On the floor, not far from the body, technicians noticed a cigarette butt. A single butt. It lay on the carpet, the filter slightly stained, ash around it. This immediately drew attention. One of the first questions detectives ask at a crime scene: what belongs to the victim and what doesn't? What's normal in this space and what's an intrusion, a trace of the killer? Later, when detectives would interview Laura's friends and family, everyone would unanimously confirm one thing: Laura didn't smoke. Never. She even told friends she found the habit disgusting, especially for someone in the beauty industry, where appearance and fresh breath mattered. So the cigarette butt belonged to someone else. Someone who was in this apartment on the night of the murder or early morning. Someone who smoked, perhaps during or after the crime, maybe to calm nerves, maybe just out of habit, not thinking about leaving evidence. This cigarette butt would become one of the most important pieces of evidence in the case, though this would only become clear decades later, when technology would allow DNA to be extracted from saliva on the filter. In the hallway, near the front door, investigators found a small black metal hook. It had been wrenched from the mailbox in the building's entryway. This was the type of hook people use to hang keys or light items by the entrance. Simple, functional, unremarkable. But in the context of the broken door, its significance became clear. Detective Mortimer, studying the door and the hook, began forming a theory about the method of entry. The door panel had been pushed out, not broken. There was no sound of shattered wood that would have woken neighbors. Instead, quietly, patiently, using the metal hook as a lever, the killer pushed out the pieces of molding that held the panel in place. Perhaps worked for several minutes in the darkness of the hallway, slowly, methodically loosening the panel until it came away enough to be completely removed. Then he had an opening, large enough to reach through and open the door from inside, turning the lock or bolt. This wasn't a spontaneous crime. This wasn't someone who saw an open window and took advantage. This was someone who came prepared, with a tool, with a plan, with patience. Someone who knew what he was doing. After the door was opened, after evidence was documented in place, the body was ready for transport. The medical examiner and his team carefully moved Laura's body onto a gurney, covered her, carried her out of the apartment. Neighbors, gathered on the street behind police tape, watched in silence. Some were crying. All were in shock. In their building, on their street, in their safe city. The medical examiner conducted a preliminary examination on scene, but a full autopsy would be performed later, at the morgue. When results came back, they confirmed what was already suspected and added several horrifying details. Laura Kempton died from massive head trauma. A blunt object, consistent with a wine bottle, delivered multiple blows to the left side of her head. The blows caused brain contusions, bruises on the brain tissue itself, lacerations, literal tears in the structure of the brain, hemorrhaging, skull fracture with penetration of bone fragments. The trauma was so extensive that death came quickly. Possibly she lost consciousness after the first blows. Possibly she didn't feel everything. It was small comfort, but the only comfort the medical examiner could offer. The time range of death was determined as the early morning hours of September 28, 1981. Based on body temperature, on rigor mortis, muscle stiffening that begins several hours after death, on lever mortis, settling of blood in lower parts of the body, the expert estimated death occurred somewhere between 1 and 4 in the morning. This coincided with the time when Laura returned home alone after her evening with a friend. She entered the apartment, maybe a few minutes later, maybe half an hour. But somewhere in those early morning hours, someone entered her home and killed her. But the autopsy also revealed another terrible detail, which detectives had already suspected from studying the scene. Laura had been sexually assaulted. Vaginal swabs were taken as part of standard protocol in murders of young women. Analysis showed the presence of spermatozoa, evidence of sexual intercourse in close temporal connection with death. Now the question was this an act before death, during, or after? Was this a rape followed by murder to eliminate a witness? Or was it a murder followed by sexual violation of the body? Or most horrifying, did the acts occur simultaneously? Violence and sexual penetration intertwined in one unified act of monstrosity? Physical evidence couldn't provide a definitive answer. But the picture that began forming for detectives was this. This was a sexually motivated crime. The killer entered Laura's home with the intent of sexual assault, possibly also robbery. When she resisted, and signs of struggle suggested she resisted, violence escalated. Perhaps the killer panicked. Perhaps he enjoyed the violence. Perhaps the original plan was only to rape, but something went wrong, and he decided he had to kill her so she couldn't identify him. Or, and this was the darker possibility, murder was the goal from the beginning. Sexual assault was part of the fantasy, but the ultimate goal was to take life, to erase this young, vibrant woman from existence, to leave her broken body as, what? A statement? Satisfaction of some twisted desire? Detectives didn't know. Yet, investigators began the painstaking work of collecting evidence. Photographers documented every inch of the apartment. Crime scene technicians searched for fingerprints on door handles, on furniture, on the wine bottle, on any surface the killer might have touched. They found many, but in an apartment where a young social woman lived, there were many prints. Her own, her friends, people who had visited. The process of matching each print, excluding legitimate prints, searching for those that shouldn't be there, would take weeks. They also found palm prints. One particular palm print on the wall drew interest. It was in blood. This meant that after the bloodshed occurred, someone, presumably the killer, leaned his hand on the wall, perhaps for balance during the attack, perhaps just standing there afterward, contemplating what he had done. Blood samples were collected. In 1981, there was no way to do DNA analysis as we know it today. But blood was still valuable evidence. Blood type could be determined. Later, if a suspect was found, his blood type could exclude or include him. It wasn't as precise as DNA, but better than nothing. Fibers were collected, from Laura's clothing, from bedding, from the carpet. Under a microscope, fibers can tell stories about the type of fabric, color, sometimes even the manufacturer. If the killer left a fiber from his clothing, and later that clothing was found, a connection could be established. Hair. Several hairs that didn't belong to Laura were found at the scene. In 1981, hair could be examined under microscope to determine race, possibly age, characteristics like color, texture, whether it had been dyed or treated. If the hair root was attached, blood type could be determined. But again, precision was limited compared to modern DNA analysis. And of course, the cigarette butt. It was carefully packaged, documented, sent to the lab. In 1981, from a cigarette butt, you could get blood type from saliva on the filter. This could narrow down suspects. But again, not as precisely as needed. Detectives worked in the apartment for several days. Every surface was examined. Every possible piece of evidence was collected. When they finally finished, the apartment was sealed. It would become a place that Laura's family could never enter again without seeing the ghosts of that night. Part 3. Investigation and dead end. From the moment the body was discovered, detectives began building a picture of Laura Kempton's final hours. First step, establish a timeline. When was she last seen alive Who was she with? Where was she going? The friend who Laura spent the evening with was interviewed within hours of the body's discovery. She was devastated, could barely speak through tears. But she told detectives everything she could remember. They met downtown on Saturday evening, went to a bar. Nothing unusual happened. There were no strange men following them or showing unwanted attention. There were no arguments or dramatic events. Just an ordinary Saturday evening. At some point in the early morning, they decided to part ways. The friend walked Laura part of the way. Then they separated at a corner not far from Chapel Street. Laura said everything was fine, that the rest of the walk was short, that they'd see each other at school Monday. They hugged. Laura went one way. The friend went another. That was the last time anyone except her killer saw Laura Kempton alive. Detectives expanded the circle. They interviewed everyone in Laura's life they could find. Her family, who lived not far from Portsmouth and were in a state of shock, could barely believe their bright, full-of-life daughter was gone. Her classmates from beauty school, who remembered her laugh, her enthusiasm, her talent. Her colleagues from Macro Polo store, who talked about what a good worker she was, how customers loved her. Her circle of friends, young people who were still building their lives and now had to deal with this terrible loss. They interviewed all the guys Laura had dated in recent months. Each was checked, their alibis thoroughly investigated. Where were you on the night of September 27, 28? With whom? Can anyone confirm? Is there any evidence, receipts, witnesses, phone calls? One by one, the guys were eliminated. Alibis held up. There were no signs of jealousy or aggression. Laura, by all accounts, dated normal guys and broke up with them amicably. There was no rejected lover, ex with a grudge, someone who threatened or stalked her. Neighbors were interviewed. Did anyone see anything unusual on the night from Saturday to Sunday? Hear anything? Strange noise? A scream? Sound of struggle? Nothing. The old building had thick walls. Residents on upper floors said they heard nothing. Neighbors from other parts of the building also noticed nothing. If Laura screamed, if she struggled and made noise, no one heard. Or more disturbingly, heard but didn't react, assuming it was just an evening argument. Nothing serious. Detectives checked if there had been similar recent crimes in the area. Were there other break-ins? Other attacks on women? Anything that could indicate a pattern? A serial offender who had started operating? There were several break-ins in previous months. Typical apartment burglaries, stolen TVs, stereos, money. But none involved violence. None involved sexual assault. They seemed unrelated. There were several reported rapes in the Portsmouth area and nearby towns in 1981. Detectives studied each one, looked for similarities in modus operandi, in victim type, in anything that could link these cases to Laura's murder. But each rape had different circumstances, different locations, different descriptions of the attacker, where they were available. If there was a connection here, it wasn't obvious. During the first weeks of investigation, hundreds of people were interviewed. Thousands of man-hours were invested. Detectives followed every lead, however weak. An anonymous call reporting a suspicious person in the area? Checked. A rumor about someone who made an inappropriate comment about Laura? Checked. A name that came up in conversation with friends? Someone who seemed odd? Checked. But every lead went nowhere. Fingerprints from the crime scene were processed. Dozens of prints. Each was checked through available databases. Some belonged to Laura, some to friends who had visited. Some were unidentified, but this wasn't unusual. An unidentified print by itself proves nothing. Maybe it was a mailman who delivered a package. A worker who repaired something in the apartment months ago. A person who sold Laura a piece of furniture at a garage sale. Without context, without a suspect to compare to, prints were just data. Blood samples were analyzed. Most of the blood belonged to Laura. This wasn't surprising, given the scale of trauma. Samples from other areas were checked. One sample, taken from bedding, showed a different blood type. This was interesting. But blood types aren't unique. Millions of people have the same blood type. Without a suspect to compare to, it was just another piece of the puzzle. The cigarette butt was sent to the lab. Blood type was determined from saliva on the filter. It didn't match Laura's blood type. This confirmed that someone else was in the apartment and smoked. But again, blood type wasn't specific enough to identify a person. Months passed. Investigation didn't slow down, but progress stalled. Detectives still worked the case every day, but new leads didn't appear. All known suspects were checked and eliminated. All leads were followed to their ends, where they died. Laura Kempton's case began turning from an active investigation into a cold case. This was a painful transition for everyone involved. For Laura's family, who every day hoped for a call saying the killer was found. For friends, who couldn't understand how someone could do this to Laura and just walk away. For detectives, who had invested so much of themselves in seeking justice for her. But without new evidence, without new witnesses, without new leads, what else could they do? The case wasn't closed. The file remained open, but active work slowed, then almost stopped. Laura Kempton became another unsolved mystery, another victim whose justice eluded, another case that detectives took home in their thoughts, knowing that somewhere a killer walked, free, possibly even enjoying the fact that he'd gotten away with it. And then, 13 months later, Portsmouth's nightmare repeated. Part 4. Tammy Little and the City's Fear. On October 19, 1982, just 13 months after Laura Kempton's murder, Portsmouth police were called to an address on Maplewood Avenue to conduct a welfare check on a young woman who hadn't shown up for work and wasn't answering phone calls. Her name was Tammy Little. She was 20 years old. She was a student at Portsmouth Beauty School, the same school where Laura Kempton had studied. Officers arrived at the address, a ground-floor apartment on Maplewood Avenue, about a mile from Chapel Street where Laura had lived. When the door was opened, what they found inside was horrifyingly familiar. Tammy Little was dead. Her body lay in the apartment. She had been killed several days earlier. The medical examiner would later determine the time range as somewhere between Saturday the 17th and Monday the 19th of October. Cause of death: massive head trauma. Her face was mutilated during the attack, just like Laura Kempton's face. Detective William Mortimer, who had led the investigation of Laura's murder, was called again. When he entered Tammy Little's apartment, the sense of déjà vu was overwhelming. For officers who had worked Laura Kempton's case just 13 months earlier, it was like stepping into a nightmare they couldn't wake from. The similarities were impossible to ignore. Two young women, both around 20 years old, both single. Both lived in ground-floor apartments within a mile of each other. Their addresses weren't on the same street, but it was the same general area of Portsmouth. Both were students at Portsmouth Beauty School, not just in the same city, at the same specific school, a small school where everyone knew everyone. Both were described as models or aspiring models, young women who were thinking about careers not just as hairdressers, but perhaps in the broader beauty industry. Both had moved into their apartments just months before their deaths. These were new beginnings, new places, new independence. Both died from massive head trauma, blunt object, blows with great force, and most disturbing, Both had mutilated faces. This wasn't just random violence. This was deliberate destruction of their faces, their identities, their humanity. Detectives immediately began looking for other connections. Did Laura and Tammy know each other? Were they in the same classes at beauty school? Did they have mutual friends? Visit the same places? Date the same people? Investigation of these questions yielded mixed results. Yes, both were at Portsmouth Beauty School, but at different times, in different classes. Maybe they saw each other in hallways, but weren't close friends. They had some mutual acquaintances in the broader circle of Portsmouth youth, but no specific close friends who were friends with both. They frequented some of the same bars, the same places where young people gathered in Portsmouth. But again, this was a small city. All young people frequented the same few places. This wasn't evidence of a specific connection. For the public, however, the connection was crystal clear. This wasn't a case of two unrelated murders. This was a serial killer. Someone was hunting young women in Portsmouth, specifically, beauty school students living alone. The pattern was too specific, too repeated to be coincidence. Fear gripped the city, especially among young women. Those who lived alone began seeking roommates. Those on ground floors tried to move higher or to more secure buildings. Sales of locks, door chains, pepper spray skyrocketed. Women no longer walked home alone at night. A buddy system became mandatory. Citizen groups that had formed after Laura's murder doubled their efforts. Friends Who Walk expanded their patrols. The Stop Seacoast Crime Committee held meetings where security experts gave advice on how to protect yourself, how to make your home more secure, what to do if you suspected someone was following you. Portsmouth Beauty School was especially alarmed. 2 of their students had been murdered within 13 months. Administration began offering self-defense classes. They arranged with local taxi companies for discounts for students who needed a safe ride home late at night. They created a buddy system where students were supposed to leave in pairs, especially after evening classes. But what could police do? They worked day and night. Every lead in Tammy Little's case was pursued with urgency. Every person in her life was interviewed. Every place she visited was checked. Every possible suspect was investigated. And in parallel, they were reviewing Laura Kempton's case. Looking for clues they might have missed the first time. Looking for connections that might now become visible in light of the second murder. They looked for a person who knew both women. Someone from the beauty school? An instructor? Administrator? Another student? Perhaps a male who was aware of schedules, knew where students lived? They looked at people who worked in the area. Mail carriers, delivery workers, repairmen. Anyone who would have reason to be in both neighborhoods, who might have seen young women living alone and perceived them as targets. They investigated the possibility that the killer was someone with medical or anatomical knowledge. There was no reason to think this, but the violence was so brutal, so focused on the head, that detectives considered every possibility. But despite all efforts, the second case went cold like the first. Leads were pursued, suspects were eliminated, months turned into years, and Tammy Little's case also became cold. For the families of both victims, this was unbearable. Not just the loss of a loved one, but knowing the killer walked free, that he had possibly killed twice and gotten away with it twice, that he might kill again. But a third murder with the same pattern didn't occur. Months passed, then years, and no new cases with the same modus operandi appeared. This puzzled investigators. Serial killers usually don't stop. They escalate. They become bolder, more frequent. So why did this killer stop after 2? There were several possibilities. Maybe he died. Maybe he moved to another area, and murders continued there but just weren't linked. Maybe he was arrested for another crime and was in prison, not being connected to Laura and Tammy's murders. Maybe something in his life changed. He got married, found another outlet for his impulses, somehow gained control over his darkest desires. Or maybe Laura's killer and Tammy's killer weren't the same person. Maybe the similarities were superficial. Maybe it was a terrible coincidence. Two different killers in the same small city, striking with similar methods within 13 months. Without evidence, without an arrest, detectives couldn't know. Cases remained open. Files grew thicker over time. New notes added periodically when a lead surfaced or when a detective decided to review the case with fresh eyes. But for Portsmouth's public, the cases of Laura Kempton and Tammy Little became legend. Stories that were told, warnings given to young women. Remember those two beauty school students? Never walk home alone. Always lock your doors. Never trust strangers. The city changed after these murders. Innocence was lost. The sense of safety that had existed before never fully returned. Portsmouth was a different place after 1981 and 1982, and two young women, full of life and promise, became symbols of that loss. Part 5. Years of waiting and scientific evolution. The 80s turned into the 90s. Portsmouth continued to change. The economy rose and fell. Buildings were built and torn down. The generation that remembered the 1981-1982 murders firsthand was aging, while a new generation grew up knowing Laura and Tammy's stories only as local folklore. But in Portsmouth Police Department, the cases weren't forgotten. Every few years, a new detective picked up the files, read every report, studied every photograph, tried to find something previous detectives might have missed. Detective William Mortimer, who had been first at both crime scenes, worked the cases until his retirement. Even after retirement, into his 70s, 80s, 90s, he still thought about them. He visited the police department periodically, asking about progress, offering ideas. The cases were his obsession, his unfinished mission. He died in 2019 at age 95, never seeing either case solved. New detectives came and went. Captain John Parachi of the Investigations Division took over leadership of cold case efforts in the 2000s. Parachi was a detective of the new era, someone who understood the power of technology, but also respected old methods, the instinct and persistence that characterized detectives like Mortimer. Parachi and his team systematically reviewed Portsmouth's cold cases. They started with old files, many still on paper, in cardboard boxes in storage. They digitized everything, created databases, cross-referenced information that had previously been buried in thousands of pages of handwritten or typed notes. But more importantly, they followed developments in forensic science. Because while cases remained cold, science wasn't standing still. The 90s and 2000s saw a revolution in forensics, the arrival of DNA analysis. DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid, the genetic blueprint unique to each person, became the most powerful tool in the forensic arsenal. The first use of DNA to solve a crime was in 1986 in England. Methods were refined in the 90s. By the early 2000s, DNA analysis became standard part of serious criminal investigations. For cold cases, this meant new hope. Physical evidence that had been collected decades ago, when technology didn't exist for its full analysis, could now be reviewed. DNA could be extracted from blood, saliva, semen, sweat, hair with root, even skin cells left on objects. In the early 2000s, Portsmouth detectives decided to review physical evidence from Laura Kempton's case. Everything was still in storage, carefully preserved. The cigarette butt, vaginal swabs, blood samples, bedding. Everything was sent to the crime lab for DNA analysis. Results came back in 2002, 2003, and they were significant. From the cigarette butt, saliva on the filter, the lab was able to extract a complete male DNA profile. From the vaginal swabs, semen, also a complete male DNA profile. The profiles matched each other. This meant the same man smoked the cigarette in Laura's apartment and had sexual contact with her. For the first time in decades, detectives had a concrete, scientific, irrefutable profile of Laura Kempton's killer. Not just a description, which could be unreliable. Not a fingerprint, which required a suspect to compare. But a DNA profile that was unique to one person out of billions. The profile was immediately entered into CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, a national database managed by the FBI. CODIS contained DNA profiles of convicted criminals, those arrested on serious charges, and unsolved profiles from crime scenes across the country. Detectives waited. If Laura's killer had ever been arrested for another crime after 1981, and if his DNA was taken and entered into CODIS, the system would find a match. There was no match. This meant several possibilities. The killer either was never arrested for a serious crime after 1981, or was arrested in a state or at a time before DNA was routinely collected, or he was arrested, but crimes were minor, not serious enough to require a DNA sample, or he died before his DNA ever entered the system. The case stalled again, but now they had a DNA profile, and they knew that sooner or later, something would change. A new lead, a new suspect, a new technology. Years passed again. Detectives periodically checked CODIS, hoping something would surface. They reviewed old suspects, people who had been interviewed in the 80s, seeing if they could get DNA samples for comparison. Some agreed voluntarily, wanting to be definitively excluded. Some refused, which made them more suspicious, but without probable cause, detectives couldn't compel them. In 2016, a turning point occurred. Sergeant John Paraki learned about a cold case in Arizona that had been solved not through CODIS, but through a new, innovative method: forensic genetic genealogy. The Arizona case involved an unsolved murder dating back decades. Investigators had a DNA profile of the suspect, but no matches in CODIS. They reached out to a genealogist named Colleen Fitzpatrick, who worked with a company called Identifinders International. Fitzpatrick took the DNA profile and uploaded it to a public genealogy database, not CODIS, but one of the commercial databases people use to learn about their ancestors. The database found matches, not with the suspect himself, but with distant relatives, people who shared some of the same DNA. Using these genetic connections, Fitzpatrick began building family trees. She worked backward from the matches, identified common ancestors, then worked forward, identifying all descendants of those ancestors, narrowing down to people of the right age, right gender, in the right geographic location at the time of the crime. After months of work, she identified the suspect. His DNA was obtained through a legal warrant. It matched. The case was solved. Paraki was fascinated. This was a new frontier, a way to use science not just to match DNA one-to-one, but to search for people through their families, through genetic connections that stretched generations back. He began researching application of this technology to Portsmouth cases. But in 2016, forensic genetic genealogy was still a nascent field. There were only a few experts, cost was high, and there were legal questions about privacy, about the rights of people whose DNA was in these public databases, without their knowledge that it could be used to catch criminals. But methodology continued to evolve. In 2018, a case that captured national attention demonstrated the power of forensic genetic genealogy on a new level. The Golden State Killer, a serial rapist and murderer who terrorized California in the 70s and 80s, was finally caught after decades of hunting. Investigators used the same technology, uploaded his DNA profile to a public genealogy database, found distant relatives, built family trees, narrowed down to one person. When he was arrested, the case was confirmed by direct DNA match. He was charged, tried, and convicted. The Golden State Killer case changed everything. Suddenly, police departments across the country began reviewing their cold cases, seeing if they could apply the same technology. Forensic genetic genealogy stopped being experimental. It became a tool that worked. In Portsmouth, Paraki and his team decided it was time to try with Laura Kempton's case. Part 6. The Breakthrough. In 2021, Portsmouth detectives met with representatives from the New Hampshire State Police Forensic Laboratory, the Maine State Police Forensic Laboratory, and the Attorney General's Cold Case Unit. They discussed the possibility of using forensic genetic genealogy in Laura Kempton's case. The DNA profile obtained in 2002-2003 was still available, but for genetic genealogy, they needed more than just a standard DNA profile. They needed whole genome sequencing, a more detailed analysis that provided information not just on the 13 to 20 genetic markers used for standard DNA profiling, but on hundreds of thousands or even millions of variations across the entire genome. Samples were sent back to the lab for this expanded analysis. Technology for whole genome sequencing had become more accessible and less expensive over the previous decade. What once cost millions of dollars and took years could now be done for a few $1,000s in a few weeks. Results came back. They had a complete genomic profile of Laura Kempton's killer. Now came time for the next step: finding relatives. In May 2022, Detective Eric Weiderstrom of Portsmouth Police received a call that changed everything. The profile had been uploaded to a third-party public genetic genealogy database. Not CODIS, not a government database, but one of the commercial databases where millions of people had voluntarily uploaded their DNA to learn about their ancestors, find distant relatives, explore their ethnicity, and the system found matches. Not a direct match. Laura's killer wasn't one of the millions of people who had uploaded their DNA to this database. But two people in the database had genetic connections to him. They shared significant portions of DNA, indicating common ancestors. And even more interesting, both of these people had connections to Rockingham County, New Hampshire, the county in which Portsmouth is located. Detective Weiderstrom immediately contacted Identifinders International, the company that specialized in forensic genetic genealogy. Their experts took on the case. The work was painstaking. Genealogists started with the two matches in the database. Using genetic data, they determined the degree of relationship. Were these close relatives, like cousins, or more distant, like third or fourth cousins? In this case, the matches indicated more distant relationship, which made the work more complex, but not impossible. Then genealogists began building family trees. They searched for common ancestors between the two matches. This required access to historical records: birth, death, marriage certificates, census records, immigration documents, everything that could help trace family lines back in time. Through weeks of painstaking work, cross-referencing, and analysis, they identified common ancestors. The two matches in the database, though they didn't know each other, shared ancestors several generations back. Now came time to work forward. Genealogists began identifying all descendants of these common ancestors. This meant compiling extensive family trees, tracking each branch, identifying every person who could be genetically related to the matches in the database, and therefore to the killer. As the tree grew, Genealogists began filtering. They looked for males, because the DNA profile was male. They looked for people of the right age, who would have been 21 or so in 1981. They looked for people who lived or had connections to the Portsmouth area at that time. The tree narrowed. Branches were eliminated when people didn't fit the criteria. Other branches required additional research. And finally, after months of work, genealogists identified two people who appeared to be the most likely biological parents of the person whose DNA was at Laura Kempton's murder scene. Subsequent investigation revealed that these two shared a single biological son. His name was Ronnie James Lee. Detectives immediately began researching Ronnie James Lee. Who was he? Where was he in 1981? Was he still alive? Records showed that Ronnie James Lee was born in 1960. In September 1981, when Laura Kempton was murdered, he was 21 years old. He had served in the United States Army until May 1981. After discharge, he returned to the Portsmouth area. Employment records showed he worked at Liberty Mutual Insurance Company in Portsmouth as a security guard from June 1981 through August 1982. This meant that at the time of Laura Kempton's murder, Ronnie James Lee was living and working in Portsmouth. He worked in security, patrolling buildings, knowing the streets, having access to areas regular people didn't. But records also showed something else. Ronnie James Lee was dead. He died on February 9, 2005, at age 45. Cause of death, according to the medical examiner's office, acute cocaine intoxication, an overdose. For detectives, this was bittersweet news. They finally had a name. After 42 years, they knew who killed Laura Kempton. But he was dead. There would be no arrest, no trial, no sentencing, no moment when Laura's family could look him in the eyes in a courtroom and know justice was served. But investigators didn't stop there. They needed absolute confirmation. Genetic genealogy pointed to Ronnie James Lee, but they needed a direct DNA match so there would be no doubt. When a person dies and an autopsy is performed, samples of biological materials are typically preserved by the medical examiner's office for records. In Ronnie James Lee's case, blood was taken during the 2005 autopsy. This blood was placed on a card, a small piece of special paper that absorbs blood and preserves DNA, and stored in archives. In 2022, 17 years after his death, Detective Weiderstrom obtained this blood card from the medical examiner's office. It was sent to the lab for DNA analysis. In June 2023, results came back. Ronnie James Lee's DNA was an absolute match to DNA found on Laura Kempton's body. A match to DNA on the cigarette butt in her apartment. A match to DNA on the bedding. The statistical probability that this was not him but someone else with a random match was astronomically small, so small it could be effectively eliminated. There was no reasonable doubt. Ronnie James Lee killed Laura Kempton. Part 7. Who was Ronnie James Lee? Now, with the killer's name, detectives began gathering information about Ronnie James Lee's life. Who was this man? What led him to Laura Kempton's door that night in September 1981? Ronnie James Lee was born in 1960. Details of his early childhood were limited in public records, but detectives were able to piece together a general picture. He grew up in New Hampshire. After high school, he enlisted in the United States Army, served until May 1981. His military service seemed normal. No disciplinary problems and records available to detectives. He was honorably discharged. After discharge in May 1981, Lee returned to civilian life. He found work quickly. By June 1981, he was working as a security guard for Liberty Mutual Insurance Company in Portsmouth. The security guard job would have given him knowledge of the city. He would have patrolled streets, possibly areas around Chapel Street. He would have seen people entering and leaving buildings, He might have noticed a young woman living alone in a ground-floor apartment. Between June and September 1981, something happened. Maybe Lee saw Laura on the street. Maybe he followed her. Maybe he knew her schedule, knew when she usually came home. Maybe on the night of September 27, 28, he decided to act. Detectives found no evidence that Lee and Laura knew each other. No mutual friends. No records of interaction. This wasn't an ex-boyfriend, not a family friend, not a colleague. This was a stranger, possibly someone who saw her once and became obsessed, or someone who simply saw an opportunity that night and took it. After Laura's murder, Lee's life continued outwardly normally. He continued working at Liberty Mutual until August 1982. Nothing in his behavior at work raised alarms. No signs that he had committed murder months earlier. But between 1982 and 1983, Lee's behavior began appearing in official records. He was linked to 5 burglaries, 4 residential and 1 commercial. His methods were consistent: breaking locks, entering homes, taking items. Sometimes he was caught, sometimes not. Then, in 1987, an event occurred that revealed the true nature of Ronnie James Lee. In Keene, New Hampshire, about 80 miles west of Portsmouth, Lee committed a home invasion. He broke into a house. But this time, the house wasn't empty. Inside was a woman. Lee didn't leave. Instead, he sexually assaulted the woman, raped her in her own home. He was caught, arrested, tried. In 1987, Ronnie James Lee was convicted of burglary and sexual assault. He went to prison. He remained there until 1990. After release in 1990, Lee's trail becomes less clear. He lived in various places, maybe tried to start over, maybe continued his pattern. Police records don't provide a full picture of his life after prison. But one thing is known for certain. On February 9, 2005, Ronnie James Lee died. He was 45 years old. Cause of death: acute cocaine intoxication, an overdose. After his death, an autopsy was performed. As part of standard procedure, samples of his blood were placed on a card and preserved in the medical examiner's office. 17 years later, in 2022, that blood card became the key to solving a 42-year-old murder. Detective Widerstrom obtained Ronnie James Lee's blood card from the medical examiner's office. DNA from this card was sent for analysis. In June 2023, results returned. Ronnie James Lee's DNA matched DNA found on Laura Kempton's body, matched DNA on the cigarette butt in her apartment, matched DNA on bedding. The match was absolute. There was no reasonable doubt. Ronnie James Lee killed Laura Kempton. Part 8. The announcement on July 20th, 2023, on a sweltering sunny afternoon, a room full of reporters and law enforcement representatives gathered in Concord, New Hampshire, at the State Police Communications Center. Attorney General John Formella and Portsmouth Police Chief Mark Newport stood before cameras and microphones. Formella spoke with the solemnity of the moment. After more than 40 years of investigation, the 1981 murder of Laura Kempton in Portsmouth has been solved. We have determined, beyond a reasonable doubt, that Ronnie James Lee killed Laura Kempton. He explained the process: DNA evidence, genetic genealogy, years of work by detectives who never gave up. If Mr. Lee were alive today, he would be charged with first-degree murder for knowingly causing Laura Kempton's death before, after, or while engaged in the commission of, or while attempting to commit aggravated felonious sexual assault. Alternatively, for purposely causing Miss Kempton's death by striking her with a blunt object. But Lee was dead. 18 years. No charges would be filed. No trial would occur. No sentencing. Justice had come too late for traditional justice. But for Laura's family, even this belated acknowledgement mattered. The Kempton family released a statement that was read at the press conference. The Kempton family wishes to express our deepest gratitude to the Portsmouth Police Department for solving Laura's case. Their diligence and determination, along with extraordinary personal commitment over the past decades, have led to this moment for Laura. The family would like to acknowledge retired Captain John Paraki, Portsmouth Police Department Investigative Division, and his team members past and present, who have worked tirelessly on Laura's case. Their extraordinary efforts have led to this important moment today. Many, many hands have touched Laura's file over the past 41 years, and the family expresses our deepest gratitude to all who contributed. The Kempton family would like to request privacy at this time as we process this information. Thank you all. Portsmouth Police Chief Mark Newport added, Laura was a victim of an unspeakable act of violence. The members of the Portsmouth Police Department have never forgotten about Laura and any of the other victims of our unsolved homicides. Attorney General Formella spoke about the broader significance. It is my hope that this conclusion and announcement will be the long-awaited first step in providing what closure the criminal justice system can provide for Laura Kempton's family and community. This should also send a message to anyone who has been affected by a case that has gone cold in this state that we will never stop working these cases. We will never forget about these victims. He described the moment as bittersweet. On one hand, Laura's family could receive a sense of long-delayed closure. On the other, revisiting painful memories can reopen old wounds. New Hampshire is a small state, and it's filled with tight-knit communities. We're fortunate that homicides are not common here, but when they do happen, they reverberate across the state. And when homicides go unsolved and cases go cold, that only exacerbates the trauma and pain that victims' families feel. Part 9. The question of Tammy Little. After identifying Ronnie James Lee as Laura Kempton's killer, the inevitable question arose. Did he also kill Tammy Little? The similarities between the two cases were striking. Both victims were young women, Portsmouth Beauty School students, lived alone in ground-floor apartments, killed by massive head trauma with mutilated faces. The murders occurred just 13 months apart, in the same city. Logic suggested it was the same killer. For years, investigators assumed a connection. The public believed in a connection. Families hoped that solving one case would lead to solving the other. But DNA evidence told a different story. At the July 20th, 2023 press conference, when New Hampshire Attorney General John Formella announced the solving of Laura Kempton's murder, he was direct about the question of Tammy Little. There was no evidence linking Ronnie James Lee to Tammy Little's murder. This meant that either evidence was insufficient to establish a connection, or the two murders, despite all their similarities, were committed by different people. Tammy Little's case remains open. Her killer is still unknown. Her family still waits for answers. Attorney General Formella expressed hope that the announcement about solving Laura's case might lead to new leads in Tammy's case. Perhaps someone will remember something. Perhaps new evidence will emerge. Perhaps the same technology that solved one case will solve the other. But for now, Tammy Little remains on the list of 100 unsolved homicides assigned to New Hampshire's Cold Case Unit. Part 10. Legacy and Meaning. The Laura Kempton case became one of many examples of how advanced technology is transforming cold case investigation. Genetic genealogy opened doors that seemed permanently closed. But it's also a reminder of the human cost of crime. 42 years. More than 4 decades. Laura's parents lived the rest of their lives not knowing who killed their daughter. Her friends grew up, started families, lived lives, always with the shadow of this unsolved murder in the background. For Portsmouth's community, Laura Kempton's case became a symbol of lost innocence. In 1981, This was a quiet coastal city where people didn't lock doors, where young women could walk home alone at night without fear. Laura's murder changed that. It showed that evil can happen anywhere, to anyone. But solving the case also became a symbol of hope. It showed that justice, even if it comes decades later, is still possible. That crimes aren't forgotten. That victims' families aren't alone. Detective William Mortimer, who was first at Laura's murder scene that morning in 1981, didn't live to see the case solved. He died in 2019, 4 years before the announcement. But his work, his commitment, his refusal to give up, laid the foundation for everything that followed. Captain John Parachi, who led cold case review efforts in recent years, stood at the July 2023 press conference with a sense of accomplished duty. 42 years of work by hundreds of people had finally yielded results. Detective Eric Weiderstrom, who was notified about the genetic genealogy breakthrough in 2022, who obtained Ronnie James Lee's blood card from the medical examiner's office, who coordinated the final DNA analysis, stood there knowing he was part of something important. All of them, and many others whose names didn't make headlines, were part of a team that finally gave Laura Kempton what she deserved: justice. Epilogue. Today on the New Hampshire Department of Justice website, Laura Kempton's case is marked as closed. Year of death or disappearance, 1981. City town, Portsmouth. Status, solved. But for those who knew Laura, for those who loved her, she was never just a case. She was a daughter, a friend, a classmate, a colleague, a neighbor. She was a 23-year-old young woman with dreams, ambitions, a future that was stolen from her in the early morning hours of a September night. Ronnie James Lee died in 2005, 18 years before his name was announced as Laura's killer. He never faced trial. He never heard a judge read a sentence. He never spent a day in prison for this crime, though he spent years in prison for others. This is a bittersweet victory. Justice was achieved in the form of truth, but not in the form of punishment. Laura's family knows who killed her, but they'll never see him in handcuffs, in a courtroom, behind bars. But perhaps knowledge itself is a form of justice, knowledge that the secret was uncovered, that the crime didn't remain unpunished in history, that Laura wasn't forgotten. In Portsmouth, on Chapel Street, life goes on, buildings age, new residents move in, the city changes, but the memory of Laura Kempton remains, in the hearts of those who knew her, in the police department archives, in the city's history. Her story became part of a larger narrative about the cost of violence, the importance of persistence, the power of science and technology in service of justice. And perhaps most importantly, her story serves as a reminder. Every crime victim is a person, not a statistic, not a headline, not a case number. Laura Kempton was a person, a free spirit with a vibrant personality and love of new wave fashion, a student dreaming of a career, a worker proud of her new job, a daughter loved by her family, a friend valued by her friends. She deserved a life full of possibilities. She deserved to grow, change, dream, achieve. That was stolen from her. But she also deserved to be remembered, not only as a victim, but as a person who mattered, whose life, though short, left an imprint on those who knew her. 42 years later, her story was finally told completely. Her killer was named. Truth was revealed. Laura Kempton is no longer just an unsolved case. She's a victim who received justice, albeit delayed. She's a person whose memory lives on. And in that, perhaps, there's a small piece of comfort. Not for Laura, who will never know her killer was found, but for those who loved her, for her family, who waited 42 years, for the community that never forgot. The case is closed, but the memory continues. Laura Kempton, 1958-1981. Gone too soon, but not forgotten, never forgotten.